you're able to collect email addresses straight off of your web traffic, US only, fully compliant, but without opt-ins. And then as long as you're handling those emails well on the back end, and in our case in Klaviyo, you can maintain high deliverability and see a lot of revenue come through those channels as well.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of What's Working in E-commerce. If you're looking to drive more revenue through email and SMS, you're not going to want to miss this episode with Ben Billups. He's driven hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue in email and SMS, and he's going to show you how to do the same. So definitely check it out. I'm Egan. I'm your host. I'm from Asymmetric Marketing. You can find us at asymmetric.pro. We can help with paid search, paid social, email automation, on-site SEO, WordPress websites, and Amazon. All right, Ben, welcome. Thanks so much for coming on. We wanted to talk a little bit about the email and SMS piece, but maybe first it'd be good to know a little bit about your background. Talk to us about what you've been doing in digital marketing and kind of the e-commerce space.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the 2-minute history here is that out of college, I was working at a bunch of different startups, kind of being the go-to-market guy, the one-man marketing band, and working in a bunch of different verticals. So, ed tech, news media, all kinds of different things. And then eventually I worked for this major 8-figure e-com brand called Bellamy. And I was doing exclusively their email and SMS marketing and a little bit of their website CRO. And so that's really where I started to develop a portfolio of experience within e-commerce. And yeah, we saw great results with them as part of their in-house talent. Took them from $250K a month in email and SMS revenue to $1.2 million a month in a 12-month period. They got acquired by private equity shortly after that. And then right around the same time, I started taking clients on the side, had a great case study with them, and then eventually left Bellamy. And I've been doing my own thing for a little bit over a year now with the agency, and we're growing pretty fast. We're adding team members right now, doing all kinds of different things. So, I mean, it's been great. And that's kind of a little bit about my background.
Yeah, that's great, Ben. I think anybody's ears are perking up there of the incredible results you got with email and SMS. Can you give us the broad strokes of how did you do that, and how do you approach email and SMS to grow sales like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, and honestly, this is kind of weirdly underrated with e-com brands, but the biggest function of how much money can you make with email and SMS marketing is your list size. And I think, a lot of brands, they just don't put enough emphasis on list growth. So I mean, when I came to Bellamy, they already had a pretty big list. I think it was like 1.7 million. Obviously, not all active subscribers, so we were segmenting on top of that. But they had a massive database to work with to begin with. And so we initially, for the first little while, we were optimizing their opt-in units. They had solid web traffic. So we were, hauling in an extra like 10,000 emails a month with that. And then I think apart from that, it's just like optimizing and making sure that we were doing the best across the board from an execution standpoint. So we audited all of their automations. We found all kinds of interesting automations, or all kinds of interesting optimizations within automations. And sometimes that can have to do with, obviously, you just want to be split testing and checking all kinds of things regarding the content, regarding the length of time between messages, different triggers, adding automations where you can for high intent customers. And then the other big optimization was really establishing a good campaign cadence for them. So you have that baseline, you have your baseline list growth, then you have another baseline, which is your automations. And then on top of that, having a really great strategy with campaigns, promotions, and content. That's enough to really catapult you into some serious revenue numbers. And then towards the end of my time there, we did get into some of these identity resolution tools as well, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, like retention.com and revenue rolls, guys like that, where essentially what you're doing is you're able to collect email addresses straight off of your web traffic, US only, fully compliant, but without opt-ins. And then as long as you're handling those emails well on the back end, and in our case in Klaviyo, you can maintain high deliverability and see a lot of revenue come through those channels as well. So yeah, happy to dive into any of those details.
Yeah, that's great. On the list growth piece, I wonder, is that opt-ins on the site? Were you guys doing things beyond that? And maybe give us a sense of where was the traffic coming from for Bellamy?
Yeah, I think it was pretty typical e-com brand, like larger e-com brand, if depending on how many you've seen, but they had strong organic traffic, which was great. And then they were also advertising aggressively on top of that. So they're sending tons of paid traffic to the site. To be totally honest, I don't remember off the top of my head what their traffic numbers were, but we just kept testing different opt-in offers. And I think part of it, and this is a little bit controversial in kind of my space, but there's a lot of opinions out there about what a good opt-in unit is. And so some they prioritize higher intent opt-in offers. So let's say, for example, a percent discount code where, a customer or a prospect is only really going to be interested in that if they're also likely to buy the product, right? If you're interested in the product, we give you 20, 30% off. That's a higher intent opt-in. What we found is that we could collect a higher volume of data with lower intent offers, which in this case was a giveaway. So Bellamy's AOV was around $250, right? It's a fairly expensive product. And so once a day, we would give away one set of hair extensions. So we would put that on our pop-up where it says, enter to win a free set of hair extensions, winners announced daily. And then we would pick one winner each day at random. We'd email them and say, hey, pick something within this budget. And so if you actually took it in terms of, you looked at it in terms of Bellamy's COGS on the products, like cost of goods and shipping, and then you evaluated that against how many emails were we collecting, the opt-in unit was bringing in emails for basically, I think it was 16 or 17 cents a pop. So it's pretty cheap emails. And it's interesting because we ran a direct split test with a percent off code on one of their accessory tools. And the interesting thing about that was we saw more revenue come through with the percent off code in a short-term period. So if you evaluate it in like a 2-week period and you say, get 30% off X product, Bellamy could have been making an extra $5,000 a month, but they were also collecting, I think it was something like 2,000 or 3,000 fewer emails per week, right? So that's that whole concept of higher intent offer is lower data volume, but also higher short-term revenue. And so I think really when you're deciding what kind of opt-in unit do you want to run, you have to look at the business, you have to look at the goals of the business. And at least in my case, we've always put a ton of priority on, we want as many emails in our system as possible. Because let's even say someone comes to us, they give us their email address and they're not ready to buy, especially a $250 product is going to have a longer consideration phase than a $50 product, right? So our thinking was, let's just get these emails in our system. And then that way we can educate them. We can also trigger automations. If they do add products to cart, like now we have the capacity to follow up with them. Whereas if we don't have their email address, it's not possible for us, right? So that was the thinking. It was more long-term revenue than short-term revenue. An extra $5,000 a week would have been great for them. But the kind of the concept we worked under was more emails in the database actually results in more future revenue than $5,000 a week, right? That was essentially the hypothesis. And it turned out to work really well for them because we were able to build a ton of leverage for them just by scaling up their list, optimizing their automations, and doing all of that.
Wow, that's awesome. Can you talk a bit about what's your tech stack? I'm curious on, pop-ups, email, SMS. If there's others too, I'd love to know.
For sure. I mean, there's a ton of options out there. For Bellamy and specifically, they were using Klaviyo for email, which, I mean, is still a great tool. People love to rag on Klaviyo, but I mean, it's, and also speaking as a guy who's worked in ESPs across different industries, Klaviyo is one of the best. And then for SMS specifically, we were using Attentive, which again, a lot of people like to rag on Attentive. I think the big advantage that Attentive has that a lot of other vendors aren't quite as good at is their delivery networks are really strong. So it's not uncommon at all for me to see if a brand is using PostScript or Klaviyo SMS for those SMS messages to land in my spam folder. Whereas with Attentive, it pretty much never happens. So, I mean, we could talk at length about contract terms. Is it really worth it? How they bill, all those different things. But I think in their case, they were operating at a level of scale where Attentive was the right tool for them. And we were using them for the pop-ups as well. They have that 2-tap opt-in for SMS. That was massive for building their list because they didn't have SMS prior to me working there. So we were able to get them up to 100,000 SMS subscribers, I think in 8 or 9 months. But awesome. A big part of that is because of Attentive's low friction 2-tap opt-in, which I know a lot of other vendors have replicated at this point, but it's a very strong way to go.
Well, that's great. Thanks for that overview. And for you guys now at Noble, do you have a tech stack you're using consistently or still using different tools?
I mean, typically we're very much like tried and true Klaviyo Shopify stack. I mean, we've been hearing great things about SendLane. I haven't actually worked with it yet. I would love to at some point. And I mean, a lot of times, if we come to a brand, we're not really trying to get them to change vendors. Because, if we come to a brand, they're using Klaviyo and PostScript. It's like, probably this is like, the marginal utility versus like the cost of migration and all those different things, generally speaking, if they've already got the vendors, we'll scale them within their existing vendors. So we don't push brands around too much. And honestly, like a lot of them do very similar things. And more so it has to do with your content strategy and your growth strategy than it has to do exactly with the vendor. The differences are fairly marginal in most cases.
Yeah. And then for SMS, what are you guys using these days? I know there is SMS Klaviyo. I'm curious if you could comment on the state of that here. We're speaking in February 2024.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that's convenient about it is that you bundle it into your email program and it's super affordable. Last time I looked at their pricing, it was among the most affordable SMS programs out there. So if a company is using Klaviyo and they want to expand into SMS and they also maybe are not massive, they're not looking to spend a ton of money on SMS, Klaviyo SMS is perfectly fine.
Yeah. And do you have a preferred SMS tool you're using these days?
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to sound like an Attentive fanboy, but when I can, I really do like Attentive. I think it's legitimately good software.
Yeah, that's great. I think Klaviyo and Attentive have been probably the most popular that people have mentioned on this show. So that's great. Well, Ben, talk to us a bit. We got a lot of things changing in the world. Maybe SMS changed just in this last year. I know some things as well with deliverability on email, wherever you want to start there, but maybe on the SMS piece, this whole thing about app to person and having to apply so you can actually get deliverability and send. Maybe you could just comment on that of what does a brand need to do right now to get going on SMS and to be able to keep SMS working?
And you're talking specifically about like just getting started and being compliant?
Yeah, I think that piece of, any sort of hurdles that you've seen come up. I know on our side, we have lead gen clients as well with asymmetric marketing. And so some of those we're jumping through hoops to basically get approved to be able to send SMS through high level. Curious if you ever run into that. Maybe Attentive is really good at just making that easy. But what does a brand need to know in terms of staying compliant when they're sending text message marketing?
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is that if you're working with a good platform vendor, they're doing a lot of things to make sure you're compliant. And Attentive is great about this too. Whereas like, let's say, for example, on Klaviyo, you can get away with more that's not necessarily compliant. On Attentive, at least when we worked with them, especially on Bellamy, they were very actively involved in saying, okay, like that your consent message actually has to, by law, have a certain contrast ratio, right? Can't be gray on gray, right? Has to be like very visible. Like the font size can't be smaller than a certain size, right? There's all these different requirements that are involved in TCPA compliance. And a good vendor is going to help you with that. I would say if you're using PostScript or Klaviyo, it's good just to educate yourself a little bit on some of those things. I mean, one of the big differences between email and SMS is that in the US specifically, email is still very much a Wild West. You can kind of get emails however you want to. Deliverability is a whole nother ball of wax, but in terms of like legal compliance, you need a business address at the bottom of your email and you need an unsubscribe link in your email. And other than that, like how you got the email, what you sent them, et cetera, like there's not a ton of regulations on that. There are a growing number of state level laws that are rolling out that are more similar to CCPA, the California privacy laws. And so I think by the end of like 2024, 2025, there will be at least 13 different states that sort of have a version of CCPA in place. So that's something to keep in mind. But on the SMS side, it's way more strict. Like if you're going to bulk send text messages, you absolutely have to have double opt-in. You have to have high contrast ratio. You have to display consent messages. You have to give them the option to say stop and to opt out, right? So there's all these different things where, it's essentially just more strict than it is with email. And then there are some vendors out there that actually leverage what they call peer-to-peer SMS, where essentially if somebody actually sends the message to someone else, like an actual human being, then that gets around a lot of TCPA opt-in requirements. But there's some variations with that too. What you can do as a commercial business with peer-to-peer, there's some gray area there. I've heard lawyers say different things, so I would just be very careful with P2P. But yeah, if you're just looking to build a list and generate opt-ins, definitely do your research. Make sure that your pop-up, your opt-in units are compliant, your use cases are compliant, and also definitely make sure that you're keeping record of when someone opts in, you actually have record of that. And if someone opts out, you're making sure that you're honoring that opt-out and you have record of the opt-out. Because we have had that situation pop up before where somebody actually filed a TCPA complaint And then we had to provide, evidence that this person did opt in. And then when they opted out, we stopped sending them messages. And that made the complaint go away. But it's like, it's not a joke, because in CAN-SPAM and in CCPA, the fines are not a joke. So you want to make sure that you're compliant.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine you're building that, you said list, I think, of SMS over 100,000 pretty quickly there. So big deal to stay in compliance. Thanks for that rundown. What's going on with Yahoo and kind of do we have to set new DNS records? What's the story these days on email deliverability for some of those, email platform, or what's the word? Email clients, basically, or services, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, we can get into some of the details here. Back in like October, November type timeline, when this was originally kind of announced, a lot of people were freaking out a little bit. It turns out it's not quite as bad as it originally sounded from a regulatory standpoint. And again, this is not a legal requirement, but these are requirements of the major ISPs, Google and Yahoo, right? I mean, Google and Yahoo together, they cover something like a 70 or 80% of all consumer emails, right? So it's pretty much all of them. So you take that into consideration. Really, what the requirements boil down to are you have to make sure that your sending is authenticated. And this is only the case if you're actually emailing more than 5,000 Google contacts or 5,000 Yahoo contacts in a single send. If you're doing that, then you're going to be considered by the ISPs as a bulk sender, and all of these new requirements are going to apply to you. If you're sending less than that, technically these requirements don't apply, but it's a good idea if you're trying to grow your list and basically get there. You want to be ahead of the curve on this. So, in terms of DNS records, the big thing is authentication. So you have DKIM, you have SPF, and you have DMARC. DKIM and SPF specifically are authentications, and these are records that your email service provider should give to you. And what it does is essentially identifies that the servers that are sending mail on your behalf from your domain are authorized to send those emails from you. That's all those records do. And they're typically TXT or CNAME records. You drop the values in there. And what that means is that when Google or Yahoo see your email come through from those servers, they say, okay, this is an authenticated sender. There's no chance that this is fraud because the owner of the domain has added these records to their domain. DMARC specifically, DMARC actually doesn't provide any authentication. All it does is it provides the ISPs with a policy that essentially tells them what to do if an email is not authenticated. So with DMARC, you have three options. You have P equals none, which is the most common, which essentially means if an email is not authenticated, the policy is let it fly through. You have P equals reject, which means that it tells the ISPs to put the email directly into spam. So it says, hey, if this email is not authenticated, send it straight to spam. And then that's P equals quarantine. And then P equals reject means don't even deliver the email. Like, don't even put it in the spam folder. If an email is not authenticated, don't even receive the email. And so it'll block it entirely. So the bottom line is that what you want to do is, even if say your Klaviyo sending is authenticated, you want to make sure that if you're using Outlook or G Suite or anything else that is possibly sending emails through your domain, you want to make sure that you've included those authentication records on your domain as well. So they're all authenticated, because you're going to be considered a bulk sender. It doesn't matter how many emails you're sending from your G Suite account. If you're sending a bunch through Klaviyo, you're considered a bulk sender, right? So you want to make sure every email provider you're using has authentication records on your domain. And then with DMARC, it's really optional. We typically use P equals none, and really the only part of the requirement is the record just needs to exist. You just need to have a policy, even if that policy is, we don't care, right? So we have a bunch of brands on P equals none. On occasion, we have had this pop up before where actually a fraudster was sending fake PayPal invoices from one of our client domains. And so in that case, P equals reject is super handy, because you're like, just don't accept the email, because obviously that can have an impact on people thinking that you're just like a completely fraudulent company if you're letting those emails fly through. So, but if you do, it's like particularly important that all of your sending environments are authenticated if you're going to have a policy that says reject or quarantine, because otherwise, like, actual emails from you that you want to inbox are going to go straight to spam or not be delivered at all. So that's the authentication part. Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm. And then I'll stop rambling after this, but that's the authentication component. And then the other big component of the Google Yahoo update is essentially new requirements about your spam complaint rate. So, and specifically, Google Postmaster is a free tool. where you can actually see your spam complaint rate according to Google. It's very handy, and I recommend that everybody sets it up. It's pretty easy to do, and it's free. You go to postmaster.google.com, you follow the steps, and probably check that at least once a week. Just make sure everything's fine. And specifically on Google and Yahoo, you want your spam complaint rate to stay under 0.03%. And for some brands, that's a challenge. For some, it's not. But because it's a ratio, it's entirely a function of your send volume. If you emailed 100 people on a Tuesday and one person marked that email as spam, your spam complaint rate is 1%, right? But if you emailed 30,000 people and 3 people marked that as spam, what is that? Is that 0.01? Something like that.
Yeah.
So
you're fine. Yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of it is like your capacity is healthier as your list is larger. And what also kind of came through, and this is actually coming straight from Jimmy Kim, who's the founder of SendLane. He put this out on social media about a week ago because he's been talking to the postmasters. And essentially what he said is, if there's a couple days here or there, like let's say one day during the month, you exceeded 0.3, it's not the end of the world. It's more so a requirement that's going to be enforced if you're consistently elevated in terms of your spam complaints. So if you're consistently over 0.3, then Google and Yahoo are going to start viewing you as a low quality sender. They're just going to start sending your emails to spam. They're just going to say, these guys, they keep mailing disengagers or they keep mailing cold contacts, whatever it is, whatever the cause is, they're going to view you as a low quality sender. So it's an important thing to keep an eye on, but especially if you're mostly growing your list through opt-ins, site traffic and whatnot, it's not going to be too much for you to worry about.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking through that. I know you have some strong views on metrics and kind of what to watch. I'm curious on the, let's say, deliverability, open rate, spam rate, things like that. How do you look at those numbers? Are you looking in Klaviyo or the email marketing tool, or is there somewhere else that you look to kind of check to see what is that spam rate? What does our deliverability rate seem to be, et cetera?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're using Klaviyo, it will report the aggregated spam rate to you, which is a good thing to monitor. But what it doesn't give you a picture of is specifically like, what was our spam rate today for Google, right? So if let's say you emailed 500 people, 100 of them were Gmail users, one of those Gmail users marked you as a spam, Klaviyo might report, oh, you're under the threshold, you're good to go. But Postmaster might say, actually, your spam complaint rate was 1% today, right? So it's something to keep in mind. So I would recommend checking Postmaster, but broadly speaking, if you're doing a good job in Klaviyo, you'll be okay. But yeah, in terms of just the KPIs that we like to see, and again, these are what we consider base KPIs. So essentially, if you're under or over any of these metrics, we consider it to be problematic. We like to see more than this in terms of considering performance to be good or high or excellent. But these are like the baseline metrics where if like any of these numbers are out of range, we're saying, okay, there's a problem that we need to address, right? And it's important to keep in mind, too, that with your KPIs, spam complaint isn't the only thing that matters. If your spam complaints are low, but you're consistently getting like 10% open rates, then over time, ISPs will actually still start to view you as a low quality sender because the ISPs like to see good engagement signals on your list in order to preserve a high reputation. So all of these things play a role. And it's just important to keep in mind. But yeah, the open rate that we typically look for is at least 30%. If it's under 30%, it's probably an issue with the segment or the audience or the content or something, right? We like to see click rates above 1%, and that's not click to open, that's click to recipient rate. Click to open rate, which is clicks divided by opens, we like to see more than 3%. Unsubscribe rate under 0.1 is generally like, that's fine. And then spam complaint rates under 0.04. And again, you can, in some cases, you can tolerate higher spam complaint rates than that, but that should be occasional. So it's like, those are the core KPIs that we're looking for.
Yeah. You say unsubscribe, that's under 1% or under 0.1%?
Under 0.1. And it really depends on where your list is coming from, right? Like I would say that's true if the bulk of your list is opt-ins. If you're using, let's say, for example, some of these identity resolution tools where you're basically collecting emails off of your site traffic, you can sustain higher unsubscribe rates. And it's not a surprise to see unsubscribe rates that are higher than that. But you have to understand sort of like what the cause is and like, could we sustain that? And generally speaking, I would take a higher unsubscribe rate over a higher spam complaint rate any day of the week. So, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. This might be a good time to talk about that, the non-opt-in email list. Who should consider that and when, and kind of what are the considerations to implement that?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest factor there, like just to just in terms of sheer ROI, you kind of need a critical mass of web traffic in order for it to even be worth like what you're spending on the tools, right? So it depends on which tool you're using and what they're billing you. But I generally don't even really consider it unless a brand is getting at least 20,000 users a month on average, because you have to remember these identity graph tools, they're going to match back anywhere from like 15 to 50%. It's a pretty big range, and it varies from site to site, and it also varies on the tool. So it's an important thing to keep in mind, even just in terms of like pure ROI. Like, are we going to get back a multiple of what we're spending on this? On sites that are set up well and that are getting a good amount of organic traffic and paid traffic, I mean, it's not uncommon. I mean, when we set up identity resolution for Bellamy, they were getting like an 11x ROI, I think, within a 30-day period, right? So you should be expecting a pretty high ROI. So it could definitely be a great tool. The other thing that's good to keep in mind with these tools is that not only are they a way for you to collect more email addresses, but they're also a way for you to identify users, high intent users, and triggering automations based on high intent behaviors in a way that's way more robust than even Klaviyo can provide. So if you've, let's say, for example, you have the Klaviyo cookie on your site and you have a cart abandonment, right? Klaviyo is only going to be able to match back opted in users who are already in your database. If you're using these identity resolution tools, you can collect the email address and identify the user at the cart level and trigger the automation all together, like basically like in one fell stroke. And so the amount of volume that you can push through these sort of like, I mean, those tend to be your highest revenue per recipient automations are abandoned checkout, abandoned cart, et cetera. So the more data that you can put in the top into those automations, they just start to print more and more money. And that's part of the reason why the ROI tends to be great. In terms of handling your list subscriptions from those tools, there's a couple of different strategies. So one strategy is to basically initiate a welcome email right away, where you essentially send them an email, let's say 15 minutes after they visit the site, and you say, hey, thanks for visiting, blah, blah, blah. Here's a little bit about us. And if you do that, I strongly recommend that you include like a really, like a almost over the top option to opt out, because they are essentially getting a cold email. I will put like a line at the very top of the email that's like, hey, are you not interested in this? Whatever, unsubscribe. And that keeps your spam complaints lower. And that can be a good way to go. If you're having any issues with spam complaint rates or performance, or basically if you're worried at all about poor deliverability from a tool like this, let's even take an example where it's like your list size is 20,000. And with a tool like this, you could potentially add like 5 or 10,000 contacts to your database a month, right? Sounds great, but actually like in the ratio, that's a lot of growth coming from non-opt-ins, right? And so in that case, I would actually recommend you basically create a segment of those contacts and you blend them into your core newsletter sends. Let's say you're pushing like 2 emails a week with like different content and promotions, value-added stuff. What you do is you just take like, new identity resolution users that you've collected in the last couple of days, and then you pair it with a segment of high quality contacts, let's say 30 or 60 day openers or clickers, right? Like a good engaged segment. You put those guys together, and then you're essentially like sending them in batches. Then if a contact engages with the email that you send, then you initiate the welcome series. So you basically build a welcome series that's triggered purely on whether or not those contacts have engaged. That tends to be the higher deliverability approach for managing those contacts. And I think in some cases, like let's even take that example I just mentioned, it's probably even worth asking the vendor to literally put a cap on how many emails you collect. So it's like you have 20,000 emails. You could potentially collect 10,000 emails. It's like, all right, let's start with 3,000 emails a month, and let's just see how this performs. And if all of your numbers are good and healthy, and clearly your strategy on the back end is good, then maybe you have the opportunity to open the tabs. If everything's fine, but your unsubs are high, maybe engagement's a little bit lower, your spam complaints are a little bit high, then probably you don't want to grow faster than that. So you want to make sure you're monitoring your rate of growth with a tool like that.
Yeah, this is amazing. Thank you, Ben. So are there tools you lean to on this or that you favor? And then help me understand, is that first email that goes out, is that through this other tool that's not through Klaviyo, your main one, and then you're blending it? Just help me understand kind of where do the emails get sent from?
Yeah, pretty much all of these tools on the e-com side. So I know what you're talking about. And that's a more common use case in like the B2B space. Most of these e-com tools, they're basically just pushing the contacts directly into Klaviyo, SendLane, whatever you're using. And that's not problematic. It's a good way to grow your list. So I guess I forgot the beginning of that question.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you answered it.
Okay.
Once you collect these non-opt-ins, you're still sending from Klaviyo. Like you're growing that Klaviyo list. I assume your Klaviyo fees are going up quite a bit based on list size, but you're doing the ROI analysis to see if it makes sense. Pretty darn interesting. I have to imagine there'll be more regulation coming down the pike about this of, all kinds of people getting on email lists that aren't opt-in. So the window of opportunity here, I could imagine, this, it may be shrinking or it may be closing. So it could be something to check out now. Thank you. Ben, I know you had some, sorry, go ahead. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was just going to tack on I think the thing that's most of these tools, the way that they're collecting their data is they're basically buying opt-in lists from some of these huge data vendors like Live Intent, and then they're essentially just tacking on an identity resolution component to it. So the email collection itself is compliant. And then also these tools, I mean, you should probably double check before you use one, but most of them are also CCPA compliant, where if a contact essentially wants to delete themselves from the vendor database, they have an option to do that. And you basically update your privacy policy. It has a link to that opt-out URL. And so if anybody's like, why am I getting this random unsolicited email, and they want to hunt around, it is CCPA compliant. It is CAN-SPAM compliant. And generally speaking, we see good performance because these vendors are incentivized to also filter the emails before they're delivering them to you to make sure that they're warm, active, engaged, like high quality data. But it does kind of live between an opt-in and a cold email. So yeah, you just want to be careful with how you do it.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And are you getting? I'm having a hard time believing that the unsubscribe or the spam rates are below the metrics you said. I imagine, do you have different metrics for these non-opt-in lists? Like how do these perform versus an opt-in list?
Yeah, no, I would say, I mean, I've seen unsubscribe rates at like 2 or 3%, right? And like I said, it's with that, it's like, I'd rather you unsubscribe right away than get a bunch of emails and complain later. And then spam complaint rates can be elevated. I think in that case, if you're really like aggressively growing with a tool like this, then really your benchmark is going to be the benchmark that the ISP set. Are we under 0.3% pretty much every day of the week? Ideally, like really the target is 0.1 and in aggregate, right? So I think you just want to keep an eye on
spam or unsubscribe?
On spam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On spam. Okay. All right, Ben, I know you've got some slides or maybe some things to show. Is it worth talking through those, or do we already cover those pieces?
Not yet. I'll share this. And this is actually a slide from a Black Friday presentation I did. But I'll show this briefly and just walk through this because I think this is one of the concepts that makes us, we can walk into almost any brand's email account and make them a ton, even if they already have strong list growth and they have like a good base of automations. This email cadence strategy is like very tried and true across a bunch of different brands. And it's something that I don't see a lot of other brands. Typically, they're not doing this. So I will share my screen here and I will also describe for our audio listeners. So I call it the infinity messaging model. And specifically, this is a messaging cadence model that's unique to your email campaigns and specifically during a promotion. And so if you're listening, it's what it looks like. It looks like an infinity symbol, right? It's big on the left, it's big on the right, and it's really small in the middle. And the way that I think about it is like, let's just take Black Friday as an example, right? It's your biggest promotion of the year, typically. What we'll do is we'll set an email calendar where we have our creative, we have a promotion, everything's in place. Now we need to tell everybody about it, right? So on the first day of the promotion, we will hit a huge segment. And I mean, it depends on in some cases, we will do a slightly narrower segment if this brand has been having issues with deliverability. But generally speaking, with something like Black Friday, people are pretty forgiving about being told about a promotion. And so we can sometimes get away even with a segment that's like 180-day engagers. In other words, we're taking anyone who's opened or clicked on an email in the last 6 months, which is very broad, right? So we'll hit a 6-month segment as day one to be like, hey, like we just announced this promotion is starting, right? And then let's say you're running that promotion for 2 or 3 weeks. In this case, the model that I built out is based on a 2-week window. Then you're sending an email almost every day, but you're changing the segment that you're sending it to. And really the core hypothesis behind this messaging model is that a contact who has more recently engaged, who's essentially more active on your list, they're going to be more forgiving of repeated messages. Whereas a contact who's less engaged, you want to reach out to them less often. So let's say you've built out a bunch of segments. You've got a 30, 60, 90, and a 180, right? As like your core engagement segments. When you hit that 180 list, contacts who maybe haven't engaged for 6 months, who do engage, now they're in the 30-day segment, right? So you're like, great, we just sent out a wide net, and now we've captured a ton of attention that maybe we wouldn't have had otherwise. Then as the promotion progresses, you're actually hitting smaller and smaller segments. So you hit your 180, then maybe you do a resend against your 180. Again, that's optional, depends on your deliverability. You could do a resend against your 180, capture more disengaged contacts. Then you hit your 60, then you hit your 90, then your 60, then your 30. You might even go all the way down to a segment like 30-day clickers or even 14-day clickers, right? Like very tight segments. But you're sending an email like every once in a while, you'll skip a day, but you're emailing almost every day. Then as the promotion is about to end, so let's say you're a couple days out from the conclusion of the promotion, or in this case, you're a few days out from Black Friday itself, you start opening up your segments again. So as you're basically making those announcements saying, hey, there's only 48 hours left in this promotion, this is our best offer of the year, whatever it is, you're continuously opening up the taps until you're hitting a bigger and bigger segment. And then you have this big crescendo on the last day where you actually hit the 180-day segment again. And you're saying, hey, like last chance, like 4 hours left, whatever that message is. That's the core concept behind the model. And I think this is something where you're going to want to monitor your metrics as the promotion progresses. And you may actually want to change your segments as the promotion progresses. Let's say, for example, you start to notice that your KPIs are getting out of range, maybe on like day 11 or day 13, like as you're expanding. And then you say, okay, KPIs are starting to get out of range. Let's not expand further than this, right? That's going to be essentially a judgment call you're going to need to make. But I've seen a ton of brands where their list is super healthy and they could be hitting bigger segments more often. And if that's the case, then your revenue potential hitting a bigger audience is obviously higher, right? And so that's the core idea behind the model. And we essentially just make adaptations for it for each promotion, but we pretty much always do some version of this, and it works extremely well.
Wow. Thanks for talking through this. And I could see how this would be so powerful Black Friday or any promotion time or what have you. So very cool. Thank you for showing this. Other slides or anything else you wanted to talk through? Or do you think it's good to have visuals on, or do we cover everything?
That was pretty much it. I feel like that infinity messaging model, it's like I said, it's just not something I see a lot of brands do. And I think if more brands started doing something like it, they'd start making more money during their promotions.
Yeah, very cool. Well, this has been a wealth of knowledge. I think people are going to get a lot out of this, Ben. Who's a good person to reach out to you? And I see you got nobleddigital.co or .co. Where can people find you, and who should reach out to you?
Yeah, so you can visit nobleddigital.co. We offer a $1 per subscriber guarantee in the first 90 days for brands that qualify. So if that's something that's interesting to you, definitely hit us up. I'm very active on Twitter and LinkedIn. So just punch my name in, Ben Billups, on LinkedIn and Twitter if you're interested in just following and learning more about email and SMS. And then, anybody that wants to reach out to me, my email is ben@nobleddigital.co. Hit me up anytime. I'm pretty fast. So, and I love this stuff. As you could probably tell, I'm super nerdy about it. And I love talking about it. So happy to chat with anyone that's interested.
All right. Well, we love learning from you, Ben. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing what's working in e-commerce.
Thanks, Egan.